The son kicked his father out of the house at his wife's insistence. The old man grieved, freezing on a bench. But a chance encounter in the park changed everything. Andrew woke up early, as he always did. Today was a special day. He was turning 80. He meticulously prepared, ironed his crisp white shirt, put on grey trousers with creases, and combed the remnants of his grey hair. Standing by the mirror, he then moved to the window and peered out onto the street. His heart beat with an uneven flutter, as if he were expecting something important, but feared it might not happen. His wife, Helen, was bustling about, busy with preparations. A white tablecloth lay on the table like fresh snow, and the dishes and treats were arranged as if awaiting a celebration. She worked quickly and skillfully, but kept glancing at her husband, sensing that something was bothering him. "Andy, stop worrying," she said, placing slices of cheese on a platter. "Everything will be fine. The guests will come, don't worry." He turned around, but his eyes revealed his anxiety. "What if they don't come?" he said quietly, as if afraid to voice his fears. "Oh, what are you talking about?" Helen sighed, trying to remain calm. "How could anyone not come to celebrate such a day with you? Everything will be all right." She believed it with difficulty, but tried not to show her doubts. Andrew hadn't spoken to his son, David, for several months. At some point, a shadow had come between them, and the conversations stopped. Today, on his birthday, Andrew hoped that David, his wife Victoria, and their 5-year-old son Timmy would come to congratulate him. 3 days ago, he had sent his son a message, clearly stating the address and time, inviting the whole family, but he had yet to receive a response. Standing at the window, Andrew reflected on his life, as if trying to understand where he might have gone wrong. He had worked for 40 years at a shipbuilding plant, was a talented engineer, and could find solutions to even the most complex problems. His colleagues respected him, and Andrew's photos often appeared on the factory's honour board. Life had been decent: work, home, family. As a young specialist, he went on a business trip where he met Helen. They met by chance, in a queue for tickets when their train was delayed due to a technical issue. They struck up a conversation and found they had much in common. 6 months later, they got married. The factory provided the young family with an apartment, and soon their son was born. They raised David with love. Andrew named his son after his father, who went missing during the war. David grew up curious, and Andrew loved spending time with him. Every evening they read, crafted, played chess, or strolled through the quiet neighborhood streets. Helen, on her part, created a cozy home. Her pies and soups were famous even among the neighbors. Timmy, barely learning to speak, affectionately called his grandmother the tas tiest, and often asked her to make something special. Andrew felt proud of his son, who grew up clever and hard-working. But David was not only a straight-A student, he loved playing with the neighborhood kids, whether it was sea ops and robbers or soccer. Everyone knew him as an active and agile boy who was always at the center of any game. The family seemed perfect. Evenings were filled with conversations, laughter, and discussions about how the day went. Everything was going smoothly. David graduated high school with honors, entered college, served in the army, and returned home as an adult and independent man. Andrew was proud of his son, but everything changed when David met Victoria. She was the complete opposite of his mother, a tall, striking blonde with a confident look and expensive manners. Victoria attracted attention, but Andrew's family accepted her with caution. Helen saw something cold and aloof in the girl, but tried to hide her feelings. "It's all for the best," she told her husband, trying to reassure herself. "If he's happy with her, then we will be too." But living under one roof proved more challenging than it seemed. Victoria increasingly complained about feeling uncomfortable. Andrew's old habits irritated her, and his quiet reproaches sparked a storm of indignation. David found himself caught between two fires. Victoria rarely appeared in the kitchen, cooked reluctantly, and considered housecleaning a waste of time. Helen tried not to show her displeasure, though it was hard for her to accept this new way of life. He's an adult. He makes his own decisions, she told her husband, though there was a hint of bitterness in her voice. After the wedding, David and Victoria moved into a dormitory provided by the construction company where he worked as an engineer. They visited his parents every week, but Andrew noticed that his son was becoming more withdrawn. Helen, as best she could, tried to keep peace in the family, but they quickly drifted apart. Victoria rarely spoke about her feelings and often withdrew into herself, which irritated Helen, who was used to heartfelt conversations. When Helen suddenly passed away, everything changed. Andrew woke up early, as he always did. Today was a special day. He was turning 80. He meticulously prepared, ironed his crisp white shirt, put on grey trousers with creases, and combed the remnants of his grey hair. Standing by the mirror, he then moved to the window and peered out onto the street. The boy was smart and quick-witted. At 6, he was reading on his own, and later eagerly learned from his father, mastering not only school subjects but also more complex things, like making simple drawings or crafting wooden models. Andrew found himself alone in his apartment, a situation that had become all too familiar since the passing of his beloved wife. The silence was deafening, and the walls seemed to close in on him more each day. So, when his son David suggested that Andrew move in with them following the birth of their son, Timothy, Andrew saw it as an opportunity to be closer to his family. "Dad, it'll be better this way," David insisted one afternoon over coffee. "You'll be looked after, and Timmy will always be around to keep you company." Andrew nodded, trying to mask the uncertainty in his heart. "I suppose you're right, David. It would be nice to spend more time with you all," he replied, hoping that this change would indeed bring them closer. Initially, the arrangement seemed perfect. Andrew took on the role of a helpful grandfather with enthusiasm. He cooked breakfast and dinner for the family, meticulously cleaning the apartment, and cherished his walks in the park with little Timmy nestled in his stroller. The baby's giggles were a balm to Andrew's loneliness. But as the weeks turned into months, Victoria began to express her discontent. Her remarks started subtly but grew sharper with time. "Andrew, you cook too rich. I've already gained a few pounds," she commented one evening, offering a forced smile as she pushed her half-eaten plate away. Andrew chuckled awkwardly, trying to brush off the comment. "Oh, I didn't realise. I'll try to make lighter meals," he promised, though her words stung. Despite his efforts, Victoria's dissatisfaction seemed to grow. "David, why don't you cook for us? You know what I like," she suggested one night, her voice carrying a hint of irritation. David looked between his wife and father, caught in a silent tug-of-war. "All right, I can try cooking more often," he agreed, though his tone was weary. As the days passed, Andrew noticed David's conversations with him dwindling. Their once lively discussions were replaced by brief exchanges, and Andrew found himself retreating to his room more frequently, feeling like an intruder in his son's life. One evening, as Andrew sat alone in his room, he heard a soft knock. It was David, looking hesitant. "Dad, can we talk?" David asked, stepping inside. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" Andrew replied, gesturing for David to sit. "Victoria and we've been talking. We just want to make sure everyone's comfortable." "Are you happy living with us?" David asked, his eyes searching Andrew's face for an answer. Andrew hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I'm happy to be with you and Timmy, but I don't want to be a burden. If my being here is causing tension, no, Dad, it's just... We're all adjusting," David said, and his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Andrew nodded, a bittersweet smile on his lips. "I just hope things get easier for all of us." As David left the room, Andrew pondered his place within the family. Andrew recalled with a heavy heart the times when he and Helen always made room for each other in their lives. She would cook, he would lend a hand, and together they managed everything related to the house and raising their son. Those memories of a simple yet joyful life starkly contrasted with the present reality. Timmy was the only one who reached out to his grandfather. The young boy cherished the moments when Andrew would tell him stories, play games with him, or take him to the park. Yet, Victoria, his daughter-in-law, often acted as if she didn't notice these interactions. "Let him do it if he wants to," she would say dismissively to David when he questioned her aloofness towards his father. Andrew slowly came to the painful realization that he had become a stranger in his own family. One afternoon, Andrew attempted to have a meaningful conversation with his son. "David, I just want to understand what's going on," he began, his voice tinged with a mix of concern and longing. But David cut him off, his tone brusque. "Dad, this is our family. We'll figure it out ourselves." The words stung, and Andrew felt the chasm between them widen even further. He stood there for a moment, searching David's face for any sign of the closeness they once shared, but found none. Later, as he sat alone on the porch, Timmy ran up to him, his eyes bright with excitement. "Grandpa, can we go to the park today?" "You promised to tell me more about the adventures of Captain Bluebeard." Andrew's heart warmed at his grandson's enthusiasm. "Of course, Timmy," he replied with a smile, grateful for this small but precious connection amidst the growing distance in his family. As they walked to the park, Andrew couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to bridge the gap with David and Victoria, to find a place in their lives once more. But for now, he cherished the moments he had with Timmy, hoping that perhaps through these small gestures, he could slowly mend the fractures in his family. Despite his grievances, Andrew didn't show it. He continued to help his son and his family, getting up early every morning to cook breakfast and find ways to be useful. His grandson, Timothy, was his solace. The boy was smart and quickly absorbed everything Andrew taught him, from reading and writing to small life lessons. However, Victoria, Andrew's daughter-in-law, increasingly expressed her dissatisfaction. Even the smallest things seemed to annoy her. How Andrew arranged the dishes in the cupboard, or how he gathered Timothy's toys. One evening, when David returned from work, Victoria approached him with a look of exasperation. She shook her head and said, "We need to change something. I can't do this anymore." David sighed, sensing the weight of her words but not wanting to argue. "What exactly do you propose?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "We need to send him to a retirement home," Victoria suggested firmly. "Let him rest, change the scenery. It will be beneficial for everyone." David remained silent, caught in a conflict of emotions. On one hand, he understood that Victoria had a point. His father did seem tired, and perhaps even a bit depressed. On the other hand, the thought of sending him away, even temporarily, felt wrong. Nevertheless, Victoria took charge. She found a retirement home not far from the city, booked a spot, and without delay informed Andrew about it. "Dad, it's for your own good," she said with a forced smile, trying to sound convincing. "There are excellent doctors and good procedures. You'll come back home renewed." Andrew held back his emotions, sensing that it wasn't just about his well-being. Yet, he didn't argue. He simply nodded quietly, accepting the decision. When the day of departure came, Victoria and David helped him pack his things. Timmy, not fully understanding what was happening, ran up to his grandfather and hugged him tightly. "Grandpa, will you come back soon?" Timmy asked, his eyes wide with concern. "Of course, soon," Andrew replied, trying to mask his sadness with a reassuring smile. The retirement home was indeed nice. Clean, bright rooms, polite staff, and a schedule filled with daily activities. At first, Andrew felt a bit better. The fresh air and tranquility helped distract him from his heavy thoughts. Meanwhile, back at home, Timmy felt lost without his grandpa. He was used to Andrew always being there, always ready to give him attention and share something new. Now the boy missed him dearly and frequently asked his parents when Grandpa would return. "Soon," David would invariably answer, avoiding any detailed explanations. Victoria, on the other hand, enjoyed the new environment. Without the extra noise and old things, the house seemed perfect to her. She even hosted a small dinner for her friends, and each of them admired the amazing coziness. Andrew missed his family. He called his son, asked how they were doing, and inquired about Timothy. David said everything was fine, but he increasingly felt guilty. One day, while walking around the retirement home grounds, Andrew wondered, should he return to a place where it seemed he was not wanted? He slowly walked along the alley, listening to the rustle of the trees, and unexpectedly made a decision. The next day he packed his things, approached the administrators, and said he wanted to leave. They were surprised but did not object. The elderly man looked determined. Andrew called a taxi and headed home. When he opened the door to his apartment, a completely different scene unfolded before his eyes. Everything had been rearranged and changed. The things he remembered were gone. Instead of his old, familiar sofa, there was now a crib, and the walls were adorned with bright posters of cartoon characters. Andrew wandered through the rooms, but none of his belongings were anywhere to be found. He peeked into the kitchen where everything looked foreign. New shelves, an unfamiliar arrangement of dishes, and a different colour scheme. Feeling disoriented, Andrew sat on a stool and stared out the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. The cityscape outside was unchanged, yet everything inside felt like a different world. Soon he heard a key turning in the lock, and Victoria and David entered the apartment. Their faces registered surprise upon seeing him. Victoria, seeing her father, was initially confused, then frowned. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she asked, a mix of surprise and concern in her voice. "I came home," Andrew replied briefly, his voice carrying a hint of vulnerability. David approached, clearly embarrassed and unsure of how to handle the situation. "Dad, we agreed that you'd stay in the retirement home for a while," he began, his voice trailing off. Andrew looked around the room, his eyes searching for something familiar. "But is this still my home?" he asked quietly, his gaze settling on the crib where his old sofa used to be. A heavy silence hung between them, broken only by the sound of Timmy running out of his room. The boy rushed to his grandfather, throwing his arms around Andrew's neck with a joyful shout, "Grandpa, you're back!" Andrew's heart lifted momentarily and he smiled, though his eyes were filled with sadness. He hugged his grandson tightly, trying to hold on to the warmth of the moment. "Timmy, go play for a while," Victoria said softly, gently guiding the boy back to his room. Once Timmy was gone, the tension in the room became almost palpable. Victoria spoke first, her words clipped and cold. "You can't just come back like this, Dad. We've gotten used to a different way of life." Andrew looked at his son, hoping for some support, but David remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. The weight of unspoken words hung heavily in the air. "Am I a burden to you?" Andrew asked, his voice trembling slightly, the question carrying years of unvoiced fears. "No one said that," Victoria replied quickly, though there was an edge of irritation in her tone. Her words, meant to reassure, only deepened the chasm between them. Andrew sighed deeply, feeling the walls of the apartment closing in on him. "All right, I understand," he said quietly, standing up with a resolve that belied his inner turmoil. "I have nowhere else to go, but I can't stay here either." As he moved towards the door, the silence in the room was deafening, a testament to the unspoken emotions that lingered between them. Andrew stepped outside, and the cold wind immediately stung his face. Yet, strangely, he didn't feel the chill. He walked down the street, his destination unknown, but with a peculiar calmness growing inside him. He knew he would find his way, even if everyone else turned away. As Andrew wandered aimlessly, the wind lifted dry leaves, swirling them through the deserted alleys. He felt lost, as if he had been ripped from the life he once knew. Strangers were everywhere. Even the familiar houses seemed foreign, and the city he had always loved now appeared hostile and unwelcoming. Passing by a park, he slowed his pace and sank onto the nearest bench. His legs ached from the long walk, and his heart felt unbearably heavy, like a stone lodged in his chest. Questions kept swirling in his mind. Why? When did it all go wrong? How could my son let this happen? He tried to find an explanation, to justify David's actions, but with each attempt it became harder. Andrew had always been proud of his son, had poured his soul into raising him, and now he felt that David had become a stranger. A jogger passed by, offering a brief nod. Andrew barely noticed, lost in his thoughts. He closed his eyes, trying to remember the last time he and David had truly connected. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Soon his thoughts were interrupted by an elderly woman. She stopped nearby, holding a small shopping bag. "Excuse me, are you okay?" she asked, looking at him with genuine concern. Andrew looked up. The woman was dressed modestly but neatly, and her face seemed kind. "I'm fine," he mumbled, though it was far from the truth. "You look like you could use some help," she said gently. "Maybe I can help you." He fell silent, not knowing what to say. What could he tell a stranger? But the woman didn't hurry to leave. Her persistence wasn't intrusive, but rather caring. "I have no home anymore," he finally said, as if admitting it for the first time to himself. She sat down next to him, folding her hands on her lap. "What do you mean you have no home? Don't you have family?" "I do, but it seems I'm no longer needed." She shook her head, looking at him with sympathy. "I understand. Sometimes family can do things that even an enemy wouldn't think of." She paused for a moment, then asked, "You're probably hungry? Come with me, I live nearby. At least have some coffee." Andrew wanted to refuse. He felt he had no right to burden her, but hunger and fatigue overcame pride. "Thank you. That would be nice," he said quietly. The woman introduced herself, Barbara. Her apartment was nearby in an old brick building. Andrew immediately felt the coziness. It smelled of homemade pies and fresh coffee, and a grandfather clock quietly ticked in the corner. "Please sit down," she invited, pointing to the table. Barbara placed a cup of coffee and a plate of cookies in front of him. Andrew thanked her, took the cup in his hands, feeling the warmth seep into his cold fingers. "Tell me, what happened?" she asked cautiously. Gradually the words spilled out. He told her everything, about his son, his daughter-in-law, the house that had become alien to him. Barbara listened attentively, without interrupting. "And now?" "What are you going to do?" she asked when he finished. "I don't know," he admitted. "You see, I've always been used to being needed. And now when I'm just a burden to them, I don't know how to live." Barbara thoughtfully looked out the window, then turned her gaze to him. "It's tough. But you know what? I think if they don't appreciate you, it's their problem. You need to start with yourself. Find something to live for, or someone to live for," she said, smiling. Andrew felt her words touch him deeply. "Thank you." "You're right," he said, smiling slightly in return. So Andrew stayed with Barbara. She didn't object, and he was grateful for her understanding and warmth, which he so desperately needed at that moment. Weeks passed. Andrew helped Barbara with household chores. They went to the market together, and in the evenings, they drank coffee and watched old movies. Barbara turned out to be a cheerful woman who could find a reason to smile even in the most challenging situations. One day, as they were passing by a playground, they heard the joyful laughter of children. Andrew stopped, seeing a familiar figure among the kids. It was Timothy. He had grown but remained the same curious boy. Andrew felt his heart ache with longing for his grandson. Timothy was playing with the other children, then suddenly stopped and looked in their direction, as if sensing someone's presence. "Is that your grandson?" Barbara asked quietly, noticing his gaze. "Yes," he replied. "Let's go say hello," she suggested. But Andrew shook his head. "No, he's better off without me." They continued on their way, but that moment left a deep mark on Andrew's soul. Now he knew he wanted to be closer to his grandson, even if it was from afar. Months passed. Andrew and Barbara became true friends, if not more. He appreciated her kindness, and she valued his care. Life was gradually improving. One day, as they sat at the table, Barbara casually said, "You know, Andrew, sometimes life turns around and gives us a second chance. Maybe you should try to reconnect with your son." His face clouded. "I'm not sure it's possible." "Well, at least try. For yourself. If not for him." Andrew pondered. Her words made him reconsider his grievances. Maybe she was right? Andrew thought long and hard about Barbara's words. Her simple suggestions seemed to stir something inside him, reopening old wounds. He wanted to believe that what had been lost could be regained, but memories of Victoria's cold looks and David's silence left little hope. Barbara understood that such a step required time and didn't try to pressure him, though she believed that the attempt was worth it. Several weeks went by. Andrew continued his quiet life in his new home, but thoughts of his son and grandson never left him. Each time they passed by the kindergarten where Timothy played, he stopped, pretending to tie his shoelaces or admire the scenery. He wanted to approach, hug his grandson, talk to him, but the fear of rejection held him back. One day, standing by the kindergarten gate, he noticed Timothy holding a ball and looking directly at him. Their eyes met. The grandson seemed to freeze for a moment, then ran towards the other children. Andrew turned away, feeling his heart tighten. "Why don't you want to talk to him?" Barbara gently asked that evening as they sat at the table. "I can't," Andrew replied. "It wouldn't be right. They pushed me away, so I have no right to interfere in their lives." "Do you really believe that? Or is it just fear?" Her words carried such quiet confidence that he had no answer. The next morning, he went about his usual tasks, helping Barbara water the plants, carrying bags from the market, arranging groceries on the shelves. But thoughts of his grandson wouldn't let go. That same day, returning home from a walk, they once again passed by the kindergarten. Andrew slowed his pace as if gathering his courage, but again walked past, lowering his head. Barbara sighed but said nothing. Time went on. Autumn painted the trees in golden and crimson colours, and the air grew colder. Andrew found it increasingly difficult to hide his longing for his family. Barbara saw this but understood that he had to make the first move himself. One evening, as they sat in front of the TV, Barbara brought cups of coffee and slices of pie from the kitchen. "Andrew," she began, sitting down next to him, "you know, sometimes people make mistakes. Not because they're bad, but because they don't understand how much they're losing. Maybe your son is just confused. Maybe he's waiting for you to take a step towards him." Andrew looked at her, doubt flickering in his eyes. "Do you think he needs it?" "I think both you and he need it." These words stayed with him all night. Andrew remembered how David always reached out to him as a child, how they would walk for hours, discussing everything under the sun. He remembered how his son proudly showed him his first drawings and how much he enjoyed helping fix things in the garage. The next day, Andrew made a decision. He took out an old address book, found his son's phone number, and stared at it for a long time, hesitating to dial. Finally, gathering his courage, he pressed the call button. David didn't answer right away. When the other end of the line finally picked up, "Hello ... Andrew paused for a moment, as if forgetting what he wanted to say. "Hi, David. It's me," he finally managed. "Dad? Where? Are you?" His son's voice sounded cautious. "Everything's fine. I just wanted to ask how you all are. How's Timmy?" The conversation was brief. David said they were doing well, that Timothy was growing and would soon start school. Andrew suggested meeting up, but David only gave an evasive reply. "We'll see." Hanging up, Andrew felt disappointment, but along with it, a slight relief. He had taken the first step. A week passed. He continued to wait, but there was still no call from David. One day, sitting by the window, Andrew noticed two familiar figures walking down the street towards Barbara's house. It was David and Timothy. His heart began to race. He quickly got up and went out to the porch. "Grandpa!" Timothy shouted as soon as he saw him. The boy rushed to him, hugging him tightly, and Andrew's eyes filled with tears. David stood a little apart, hesitating to approach. Andrew looked up and met his son's eyes. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. David nodded, stepped closer, and extended his hand. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, and his voice carried genuine remorse. The bridge that had been crumbling for so long finally began to rebuild. For the first time in a long while, Andrew felt he had a family again. The embrace of his grandson, the warm words of his son, all of it seemed to erase years of hurt and disappointment. They entered the house where Barbara was already setting the table. Her warmth and care created a sense that this was not just a gathering of relatives, but a reunion of long-lost friends. Timothy curiously examined the old clock in the corner, endlessly asking questions about how it worked. Barbara smiled as she explained that the clock had been left to her by her parents, and Andrew added to the story, recalling how similar ones stood at his grandmother's. David listened silently, but his face showed that he was glad to be near his father again. When everyone sat down at the table, Timothy suddenly asked, "Grandpa, are you going to come back home with us now?" The question left the adults momentarily speechless. Andrew looked at his son, as if passing the decision into his hands. David clearly hadn't expected such a direct question from his son. He lowered his gaze to his cup of coffee, then quietly said, "Timmy, Grandpa lives here now. We'll discuss it, okay?" The boy frowned but didn't argue. His simple desire to see his grandpa at home reflected what Andrew felt in his heart. He missed his family. After dinner, David lingered on the porch with his father. Timothy was already asleep, comfortably settled on the couch in Barbara's room. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the setting sun paint the sky in warm golden-pink hues. "You know, Dad, I often remember how we used to walk together," David unexpectedly began. "Back then, I thought you were the strongest person in the world." Andrew smiled faintly, listening to his son's words. "And now?" he asked, looking at David. "And now I feel like I've let you down," he replied. "Forgive me for that." Andrew patted him on the shoulder but said nothing. He understood that these words were not easy for his son. "You'll always be my son, David, no matter the circumstances." That night, Andrew lay awake for a long time. He lay in his room replaying the conversation in his mind. It seemed to him that there was still an insurmountable wall between them, but now he saw glimpses of light behind it. Several days passed. David visited his father a couple more times, sometimes bringing Timothy. These meetings were warm but restrained. Victoria didn't appear, and Andrew didn't ask about her, understanding that it could only make things worse. One day, as they were getting ready for a walk, Andrew noticed that David looked worried. "Did something happen?" he asked, putting on his jacket. "Just some problems at work. Victoria is unhappy too. Lately, everything's been different," his son replied, avoiding his father's gaze. Andrew didn't press for details. He knew that in such situations, it was best to let a person come to their own conclusions. Meanwhile, Timothy, noticing that the adults' conversation had taken a serious turn, took his grandpa's hand. "Grandpa, let's go to the park. I want you to show me how to shoot a bow again." Andrew smiled and agreed. Their walk was eventful. They played, fed the birds, and reminisced about past times. Timothy laughed, and Andrew felt that these moments brought them even closer. That evening, David stayed alone with his father. Barbara had gone to rest, and Timothy was already asleep. "Dad, I want to ask you something," David began, hesitating a bit. "Of course ask," Andrew replied calmly. "I see you're happy here with Barbara, but I can't help thinking that maybe we should have done things differently so you could have stayed with us." His son's voice trembled. Andrew sighed heavily. "David, I understand what you're saying, and I hold no grudge. But we each have our own lives now. You need to sort things out with yourself, with your family. I can't, and don't want to be the cause of your disagreements. David nodded, but his face remained tense. Just know that if you ever need help or support, I'll always be there, Andrew added. In response, his son silently squeezed his father's hand. The next day, David came again, but this time with Victoria. Andrew was surprised to see her at the door. She looked reserved but polite. "Hello, Andrew," she said with a slight smile. "Hello, Victoria," he replied, watching her closely. Barbara, noticing the tense atmosphere, quickly offered coffee. Victoria didn't refuse, which in itself was unexpected. The conversation at the table was cautious. Victoria spoke little, mainly answering Barbara's questions. Andrew didn't interfere but observed her. At some point, Victoria herself brought up the topic that concerned them all. "Andrew," she began, not raising her eyes, "I want to apologize. I'm sorry that David and I couldn't find a way to connect with you." Andrew was surprised but remained calm. "That's in the past. The important thing is that you're here." That evening, the conversations were difficult, but they marked the beginning of what could be a new chapter in their lives. Andrew understood. He couldn't change the past, but the future was still in their hands. After Victoria's visit, time flowed slowly. Andrew was glad that, despite the cold start, the conversation set a new tone for their relationship. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger. David visited more often, sometimes with Victoria, sometimes alone. Timothy was always there, each time filling Barbara's house with his loud laughter and endless questions. With Barbara, the boy quickly became friends and started calling her Grandma Barbara, which brought a genuine smile to her face. However, something in David's behavior began to worry Andrew. His son looked troubled, steering conversations towards unrelated topics, and when it came to work or family, he became distant. One day, when they were alone, Andrew decided to speak up. "David, what's going on?" he asked, looking intently at his son. David lowered his gaze, rubbed his temples, and with difficulty said, "It's complicated, Dad. Victoria and I seem to be heading for a divorce." These words sounded like a thunderclap on a clear day. Andrew froze, trying to process what he had heard. Divorce? What happened? David sighed heavily. "We haven't understood each other for a long time. Victoria says I spend too much time at work, and I can't understand her constant demands. We've become strangers." Andrew looked at his son, feeling both pity and helplessness. He knew that such things couldn't be resolved overnight, and understood how painful this was for David. "And Timmy? Does he know?" Andrew asked cautiously. "Not yet," David replied. "I don't know how to tell him." His son's words brought Andrew back to the past when he had experienced the loss of Helen. The pain, loneliness, confusion, all of it was familiar to him like no one else. "David, listen. I'm not going to tell you that you have to fix everything. But if you love her, if she's important to you, try to fight. For Timmy, for yourself." David nodded, but uncertainty was evident in his eyes. Several days passed. One morning, while Barbara was cooking in the kitchen, she noticed Andrew sitting by the window with a thoughtful look. "Is something wrong?" she asked, coming closer. "David and Victoria are getting a divorce," he replied quietly, still trying to figure out how to support his son. "That's tough, but maybe it's their path to something better." Andrew didn't answer. He feared that this breakup would destroy not only their family, but also his relationship with his grandson. A dramatic turn occurred a week later. David, who arrived without warning, was agitated and visibly upset. "Dad, I need your help," he began, struggling to maintain his composure. "What happened?" "Victoria wants to move to another city with Timmy. She thinks it would be better for him. But I can't let her take him." Andrew felt the ground shift beneath him. "Move? Why?" "She says it's for Timmy, for a new life." David sighed heavily. "But I can't agree. He's my son." These words stirred old, long-forgotten feelings in Andrew. He remembered how he once faced a choice to leave everything and go away or fight for what was dear. "What are you going to do?" he asked, trying not to show his growing anxiety. "I don't know." "I'm lost, Dad. Help me." Andrew pondered. He knew he had no right to interfere, but understood that he had to support his son. "You need to talk to her, not through anger or reproach. Tell her what you feel, what it means to you." David nodded, but his eyes showed fatigue. That evening, Andrew couldn't sleep for a long time. He remembered how he once didn't have the strength to fight for his home, for what was dear to him. He didn't want David to repeat his mistakes. A few days later, David returned, but this time with Timothy. The boy was cheerful, but Andrew noticed that his son's eyes betrayed tension. "I talked to Victoria," David said when they were alone. "She agreed to stay, but only on the condition that I change my attitude towards the family." "And are you ready?" Andrew asked calmly. "I don't know," David answered honestly. This moment marked the beginning of a new phase for everyone. Andrew understood that the struggle was just beginning, but deep down he believed that his son had a chance. He promised himself that he would do everything to support him, no matter how difficult the path. A few days later, the situation escalated. David arrived late in the evening, waking Andrew with his unexpected visit. "Dad, I don't know what to do anymore," he said, not even taking off his coat. "Sit down. Tell me what happened," Andrew replied calmly, trying to hide his anxiety. David sat down on a chair and covered his face with his hands. "Victoria said she talked to a lawyer. She's going to court to get the right to move with Timmy." Andrew felt a tightening inside. "And what are you going to do?" "A court battle could drag on for months. She says it will only make things worse for Timmy. And maybe she's right. But how can I just let him go?" David looked broken. Andrew didn't immediately find the words to say. He understood that this moment could determine not only David's life, but also his grandson's. "You need to understand what's important for Timmy," he said, trying to speak as gently as possible. "Are you sure that a fight is what he needs right now?" David remained silent, and his silence spoke louder than any words. The next day, Timothy came to see Andrew himself. The boy looked unusually quiet and subdued. He sat next to his grandfather and remained silent for a long time, staring at the floor. "Did something happen?" Andrew asked cautiously. Timothy looked up. "Grandpa, Mom said we might move. Is that true?" At that moment, Andrew felt the full weight of the situation descend upon him. He hugged his grandson, trying to find the right words. "Timmy, your mom and dad want you to be happy," he began, "and I'm sure they'll do everything to make sure you're okay." "But I don't want to move," the boy interrupted, hugging his grandfather tighter. "I don't want Mom and Dad to fight anymore." Tears began to roll down his cheeks. Andrew felt a heaviness rising in his chest. Before him stood a child who simply wanted his family to be together. And it was the most challenging trial of all. "Timothy, I know this is hard, but sometimes adults need time to figure things out," Andrew said gently. The boy remained silent, then quietly asked, "And will you be with me?" Andrew couldn't hold back his tears. "Of course I will," he replied firmly. This scene left a deep mark on Andrew's soul. He saw how the situation was tearing apart not only David, but also his grandson. He decided that he could no longer stay on the sidelines. The next day he went to see Victoria. David didn't know about this visit, but Andrew felt he had to talk to her himself. Victoria opened the door, surprised by his appearance. "Andrew, is something wrong?" she asked, clearly tense. "We need to talk," he replied calmly. She reluctantly invited him in. The house was quiet, and Andrew noticed that Timothy wasn't there. "I understand that things are complicated between you and David," he began, sitting on a chair, "and I'm not going to teach you how to live. But Victoria, think about Timothy." "That's exactly what I'm thinking about," she replied sharply. "He'll be better off away from these fights and tension. But don't you understand that separating from one of his parents will be even more painful for him?" Victoria fell silent. Her gaze softened, but she still held her ground. "I want him to be happy," she said quietly. "Then talk to David. Try to find a solution that's best for everyone." Andrew didn't expect her opinion to change instantly. He only hoped that his words would touch something inside her. That evening, David called his father. "Dad, Victoria said she wants to discuss everything again. She suggested temporarily postponing the move." "That's good news, David. Now the main thing is not to miss this chance." David exhaled, and hope was evident in his voice. Andrew understood that there were still many difficulties ahead, but he was ready to do everything to help preserve the family he had fought for so long. The following weeks were filled with constant discussions. Victoria and David tried to find a compromise, but each conversation left a heavy residue. They seemed to walk in circles, a step towards each other, then 2 steps back. Andrew stayed by his son's side, ready to lend a shoulder at any moment. However, he saw that David was losing strength. Too many emotions, too little hope. "Dad, sometimes it feels like it's all in vain," David admitted one evening, sitting on Barbara's porch. "We're too different, Victoria and I." Andrew looked intently at his son. "Maybe, David. But you need to be sure that you've done everything you could. Not for her, not for yourself, but for Timothy." David nodded, but an internal struggle was evident in his eyes. Meanwhile, Victoria increasingly left Timothy with David. She said she needed time to think. The boy became more withdrawn. One day, sitting with his grandfather on a bench in the yard, Timothy unexpectedly asked, "Grandpa, did you ever think that everything could go back to the way it was?" Andrew looked closely at his grandson. "In life, many things change, Timmy. But sometimes it takes time to figure out how to move forward." "But I don't want things to change," the boy said quietly. These words struck Andrew to the core. He understood that for a child, such changes were a heavy burden, but he didn't know how to ease his suffering. A few days later, Victoria raised the issue of moving again. This time her tone was firm and her intentions were final. "David, I'm tired of this endless struggle," she said. "You can see for yourself that it's leading nowhere." "Victoria, what about Timothy? Have you ever asked what he wants?" She lowered her gaze, but only briefly. "I think about him every minute, and that's why I believe this is for the best." This phrase was like a blow. David tried to argue, but Victoria had already decided for both of them. Andrew learned about it in the evening when his son arrived with Timothy. David looked subdued but tried to hold on for his son's sake. "Dad, it seems this is the end," he said when the boy went to another room. Andrew remained silent for a long time, trying to find the right words. "You did everything you could, David, and Timothy knows that." "But how will he cope with it?" David asked, his voice trembling. Andrew found no answer. He knew that no words could heal such a wound. The next day, Victoria came for Timothy. She tried to remain calm, but the boy immediately sensed something was wrong. "Mum, are you taking me away again?" he asked, looking her straight in the eyes. Victoria took his hand, but Timothy broke free and ran to his grandfather. "Grandpa, I don't want to leave," he cried, hugging Andrew. The situation was heating up. Victoria began to lose patience. "Timothy, we have to go, right now," the boy cried. Andrew felt helplessness envelop him. He knew he had no right to interfere, but he couldn't just watch his grandson suffer. "Victoria, maybe you could wait," he tried to persuade her. "No, Andrew, this has dragged on. He needs to understand that this is for the best." These words sounded like a verdict. Timothy, crying, clung to his grandfather, but Victoria still took him away. Andrew watched them leave, feeling as if his heart was breaking. He knew there was nothing more he could do. David, returning in the evening, looked devastated. "Dad, I've lost everything," he said quietly, sinking onto a chair. "No, son. As long as you're there for Timothy, you haven't lost the most important thing." After a sleepless night, Andrew sat by the window looking into the darkness beyond the glass, trying to find some hope. But with each hour, he realized more and more, some wounds cannot be healed. After Victoria took Timothy away, Barbara's house once again plunged into anxious silence. Andrew sat by the window, leaning wearily on the armrest of the chair. Memories kept playing in his mind. David's pain, Victoria's cold voice. None of it gave him peace. David, who returned hours after Victoria left, looked drained. He sat across from his father, staring silently at the table. Andrew understood that any attempt to console his son would only deepen his suffering. But remaining silent was unbearable. "David, you did everything you could," he finally said, trying to speak firmly. "Timothy will understand." "And what about me, Dad?" David asked. His voice was filled with pain. "I can't just wait. She'll take him away and I'll never be able to be with my son like before." His son's words hit harder than Andrew had anticipated. He felt his heart tighten in his chest. These feelings, helplessness, loss, bitterness, were too familiar to him. He remembered how he once regretted not being able to protect his family from falling apart. That night, Andrew couldn't sleep. Staring at the dark sky outside the window, he suddenly realized that his strength was waning. The thoughts weighing heavily on his mind pulled him deeper. The next day, he tried to distract himself. He helped Barbara in the kitchen, trimmed the bushes in the garden. But all of it was just an attempt to drown out the pain. "Andrew, you don't look well," Barbara said cautiously. "Everything's fine," he replied shortly, but his voice sounded too unconvincing. By evening, Andrew's condition worsened. His head spun, and his body felt like lead. He tried to stand up to go to his room, but suddenly felt his legs give way. Darkness enveloped his eyes, and he collapsed to the floor. Barbara, hearing the noise from the kitchen, saw him lying motionless. "Andrew! Oh, God, what's happening?" she cried out. She quickly called an ambulance, trying to keep panic at bay. Her hands trembled, but she still checked his pulse, applied a wet cloth to his forehead. When the doctors arrived, Andrew could no longer speak. He only weakly squeezed Barbara's hand, trying to communicate something with his eyes. "A stroke," one of the doctors stated. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." Barbara went with him, leaving David a brief message. In the hospital, Andrew was placed in intensive care. The doctors tried to stabilize his condition, but the initial prognosis was grim. Part of his body remained immobile, and his speech became incoherent. David arrived at the hospital a few hours later. His face was pale, his gaze lost. Barbara met him at the door of the ward. "Will he wake up?" David asked with hope. "The doctors say it's serious, but he's strong, David. He'll fight," Barbara replied, though she wasn't sure of her own words. They entered the ward. Andrew lay on the bed, connected to machines. His gaze was conscious, but he couldn't speak. David sat beside him, took his father's hand, and for the first time in a long time cried, "Dad, you have to get better. I need you. Timothy needs you," he said quietly, looking at his father. Andrew weakly squeezed his son's hand, indicating that he heard him. In the following days, David and Barbara took turns keeping vigil by his bed. Victoria, upon learning what had happened, brought Timothy to the hospital. The boy ran up to his grandfather's bed, looking at him with wide eyes, and, quietly, asked, "Grandpa, will you get better? You promised we'd still play in the park." Andrew struggled to raise his hand and gently patted his grandson's head. His eyes filled with tears. This moment touched even Victoria. She turned away, but her shoulders shook. "Timmy, let's go," she said softly, taking the boy's hand. But Timothy hugged his grandfather even tighter. "I love you, Grandpa," he whispered, pressing against him. Andrew smiled weakly. He wanted to respond, but the words got stuck in his throat. When Victoria took Timothy away, David remained in the ward with his father. He sat silently for a long time, then suddenly began to speak. "Dad, I thought I could fix everything, that the family could be saved, but maybe it's my fault. I wasn't like you. You were always strong. And His voice trembled, and he fell silent. Andrew wanted to contradict, but his body didn't obey. He could only look at his son, conveying his support with this single available gesture. These days became a trial for everyone. Barbara, seeing Andrew's suffering, understood that his heart was broken not only by the illness, but also by the family drama unfolding before him. Several months passed. Andrew was still in the hospital, but his condition began to improve. He gradually regained mobility in his hand, learned to speak again. And although the path was difficult, he tried his best. Every day, David and Timothy visited him. They brought him books, read aloud, and even showed funny videos on the phone. Timothy, sitting nearby, told his grandfather stories that happened at school, and in these moments Andrew found new meaning. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but looking at his son and grandson, he realized he wasn't alone, and that gave him the strength to fight. Timothy became the main support for his grandfather. The boy supported Andrew as best he could. "Grandpa, you promised we'd still shoot the bow, and promises need to be kept." Andrew nodded with a smile, feeling his heart fill with warmth from the interaction with his family. David changed too. He spent more time with his son, took an interest in his achievements, and supported him in everything. Victoria, who had long remained a distant observer, one day came to Andrew alone. She sat next to his bed, remained silent for a long time, then said, "You know, Andrew, you were right. I thought I was doing everything for Timothy, but it seems I forgot to ask what he needed." Andrew nodded, not interrupting. "I realized I can't leave. It won't solve anything. We need to try again with David," she continued. Her voice carried remorse and hope. Andrew looked at her with a warm smile, as if indicating he was glad about her decision. These words marked the beginning of change. Victoria and David began working on rebuilding their relationship. They attended family counselling, talked more, trying to listen to each other. When Andrew returned home from the hospital, the entire family greeted him like a hero. Timothy was the first to run up to his grandfather and help carry his bag to the room. David, smiling, proposed a toast to his father's health, and Victoria served his favourite dish, prepared from a recipe recorded by Helen. "Grandpa, can we go to the park now?" Timothy asked during dinner. "Of course, Timmy." "We'll go tomorrow," Andrew replied. His voice was firm, as if it had never trembled from illness. The following Saturday, the whole family went for a picnic. Andrew sat on the grass watching Timothy and David fly a kite. Victoria brought a basket of food, and Barbara, deciding to join the outing, poured everyone tea from a thermos. Andrew smiled. He saw before him not just a family, but people who had learned to be there for each other. Their path had been difficult, but they found the strength to start anew. In the evening, when everyone gathered at the table, Timothy unexpectedly said, "Grandpa, did you know I tell everyone at school how cool my grandpa is?" Everyone laughed, and for the first time in a long time, Andrew felt his heart truly at peace. Life doesn't always give perfect circumstances, but it gives a chance to correct mistakes, to forgive, to learn to appreciate what you have. Andrew knew that this family would still face challenges, but now he was confident. They would overcome them together.